Hello and welcome back to a new video. In this video, we are going to learn about Warren Hastings Plan of 1772. It is also known as the first Judicial Plan of 1772. This is an important topic. This may come in short notes or even in a longer question. So let us understand about Warren Hastings Plan of 1772. This is module 1.1.2 from the Mumbai University syllabus for the second year BA LLB students. Warren Hastings introduced the Judicial Plan of 1772. He was also the first Governor General of Bengal. And from here, we can see how modern administration of justice developed in India. Now, what has happened before 1772? So, we had disordered Mughal institutions. There were no uniform courts, although the 1726 Charter and 1753 Charter introduced mayor courts and regulation of mayor's courts. Even then too, there are no uniform courts. In fact, in the last video, we learnt about the establishment of the small causes court. But yet there were a lot of issues. Also, the local officials delivered or gave judgments arbitrarily. The land revenue and judiciary were mixed. There were still a lot of problems which could not be rectified by the previous two charters of 1726 and 1753. So Hastings' reform created regular courts. He also separated judicial and revenue functions and introduced native laws for natives. That is, the local inhabitants would be governed by their customary laws, like Hindus would be governed by Hindu laws and Muslims by Muslim laws. So these were the changes that Warren Hastings planned to introduce in 1772. Now let us look at the background first before we jump into the Warren Hastings Plan of 1772. The Mughal administration collapsed after the Battle of Buxar in 1764. The company got Diwani rights. That is, Diwani means revenue, so they could collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, other than Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. They also got additional Diwani rights from these three regions. The judicial officers were not trained. There were allegations of corruption by the company servants. Criminal and civil justice was arbitrary. Yet, after the introduction of both the charters of 1726 and 1753, there was no legal code maintained. Although Mayor's Court was meant to be a court of record, yet there was no uniform procedure even till then. There were a lot of complaints from the Indian subjects or Indian inhabitants or population. So the company realized legal reforms was necessary to maintain administration and revenue. So this was a constant process of changes that the court system went through from 1600 till 1753, and now in 1772 the Judicial Plan was introduced by Warren Hastings. So what were its main features? One was to separate the revenue and judicial functions. This was the first time there was a separation of powers. District collectors were not allowed to administer civil justice. The civil and criminal matters were handled by separate courts. So this is two most important point, wherein the collectors were not allowed to administer civil justice. In the earlier 1753, we had seen that collectors were administering civil justice. Now they were not allowed to do that. Instead, separate courts were established for both the civil and criminal matters. So this was the first step towards separation of powers, that is revenue collection powers and judicial function in India. Now, civil courts were also known as Diwani Adalats. Diwani, of course, we know here, we've seen that earlier. Diwani means revenue. So there were these civil courts or Diwani Adalats. So each district had a Mufassil Diwani Adalat, and it was presided over or managed by a collector who also acted as a judge. He was assisted by the native law officers, local law officers. For Hindus, a Pandit was employed or he was appointed, and for Muslim laws, a Maulvi was appointed. So they would assist the collector who acted as a judge in handling the civil matters or the matters of the Diwani Adalats or the civil courts. What was the jurisdiction of the civil court? Civil disputes included property matters, inheritance, marriage, contracts. Hindu personal laws, basically Hindu personal laws was used to hear cases related with Hindus, and Muslim law was used to resolve the disputes of Muslims. So personal laws were used to hear cases, civil matters. So first regular civil courts created by the British was through the Judicial Plan of 1772. This was also known as the Warren Hastings Plan of 1772. So civil courts were also known as Diwani Adalats. Criminal courts were established. These were known as Faujdari Adalats. Each district had a Faujdari Adalat, as it had the Diwani Adalats. Now here, these courts were presided over by the Indian Qazis and Muftis, but the collector supervised it. Collector acted as a judge in the civil court, but he did not judge here to respect basically Muslim criminal laws. The jurisdiction included all criminal matters, and punishment was as per the Islamic criminal law. Severe punishment like death, amputation, as per the Islamic criminal law, required confirmation of a higher court. So there was a restriction on what kind of punishments could be handed over. So death and amputation would require confirmation of a higher court, mostly the Privy Council or the Governor and Council. The appeals of the civil court would go to Sadar Diwani Adalat. Diwani Adalats were the civil courts, and all appeals of the civil court would go to Sadar Diwani Adalat. Now, Sadar Diwani Adalat was composed of governor and council. They acted as judges here in the Sadar Diwani Adalat or the appellate civil courts. Native law officers helped the governor and the council. Their functions was to hear appeals from the district Diwani Adalats. The Sadar Diwani Adalat also controlled and supervised the subordinate courts, that is the lower courts, that is the civil courts or district Diwani Adalats. So this was the function and composition of the Sadar Diwani Adalat. This is the appellate civil court located at Calcutta. Now Sadar Nizamat Adalat. This is the appeals from the criminal courts. The appeals of the all appeals of the criminal nature would go to Sadar Nizamat Adalat. This was presided over by the Nawab of Bengal. He was nominated here. The company officers held the real power. He was assisted, this Nawab of Bengal was assisted by Qazis and Muftis. His function was to confirm death penalties and ensure proper application of Muslim criminal law. So this is how the court system was structured in 4 parts: civil courts and criminal courts. So we had district civil courts, also known as Diwani Adalats. The collector was the judge and its jurisdiction was property, inheritance, marriage, contracts. The Faujdari Adalat was the criminal court and it was presided over by the Muftis and Qazis, and Muslim criminal law was applicable at that time, and the collector supervised the Faujdari Adalats. The Sadar Diwani Adalat, which is also the appellate civil court, which was located at Calcutta, was composed of governor and council acting as judges, and they heard the appeals from the district Diwani Adalats. They also controlled and supervised the district Diwani Adalats. And then we have Sadar Nizamat Adalat. Sadar Nizamat Adalat is the appellate criminal court. The Nawab of Bengal was nominated to preside over the matter, the cases, but the real power was in the hands of the company's officers. Here, they would confirm death penalties, amputation as per the Muslim criminal law. Moving forward, we see that 1772 plan introduced the use of personal laws for Indians. Hindu law was applied to Hindus and Muslim law was applied to Muslims. If there was an issue which was not covered by either of the personal laws, the court applied equity and good conscience. This later evolved into justice, equity and good conscience. Also, court fees were introduced. This was introduced to reduce the litigation and also to reduce the frivolous suits that were being brought to the courts. And in a way, this also brought revenue to the company. So this is an important first thing. Court fees was introduction of the court fees. Registrars and record keeping was established. This was also done in the previous charters, but the implementation was not there. Now the courts were required to maintain written records. This was an important shift, wherein earlier from oral to written legal culture. That is, earlier the record keeping was more oral rather than written, and this ensured transparency, accountability and uniformity across the different presidencies. A new concept of the legal supervision. Earlier we saw the district courts were supervised by the Sadar courts and the Faujdari courts was supervised by the Sadar Nizamat Adalats. So criminal cases, criminal courts and civil courts. And the proper appellate system was introduced. This ensured uniformity and discipline. So what was the significance of this plan of 1772 by Warren Hastings? So it was the beginning of the modern judicial system. Introduced separation of powers. District courts were introduced in India. Personal laws were recognized officially. Now, Hindu laws and Muslim laws were applied to Hindus and Muslims respectively. And where no defined laws could be applied to both, then the law of equity or the concept of equity and good conscience was applied. First, appellate structure established, proper appellate structure. The civil courts appeal would go to that is the district courts, civil district courts appeals would go to, these are also known as Diwani Adalats. They would go to Sadar Diwani Adalats, and Faujdari Adalat appeals would go to Sadar Nizamat Adalats. So this will have to understand what is the flow of appeal from the civil courts to and the criminal courts. All right. Written judgments and record keeping, which we understood earlier. The justice was more predictable and accessible now. It became a model for later plans of 1774, 1780 and 1781. It transformed the company from a trading body into a territorial power with judicial functions. Okay, let us go through short questions. Who introduced the Judicial Plan of 1772? It was Warren Hastings who introduced the Judicial Plan of 1772. What were Diwani Adalats? These are the district civil courts established under the 1772 plan, presided over by collectors. Important, presided over by the collectors. Which personal laws were applied under the 1772? Hindu law for Hindus and Muslim law for Muslims. What was Sadar Diwani Adalat? This was the highest civil appellate court located at Calcutta. Which court handled criminal appeals? Sadar Nizamat Adalat handled criminal appeals. Okay, long questions and answers. Discuss the main features of Warren Hastings' plan of 1772. Here we have to talk about separation of powers, Diwani and Faujdari Adalats, personal laws, appellate courts, record keeping and court fees. These are the main features of the Warren Hastings Plan of 1772. Explain the significance of the Judicial Plan of 1772 in Indian legal history. It laid the foundation of modern courts, personal laws, appellate structure, separation of judiciary and revenue. Third, describe the structure and jurisdiction of Diwani and Faujdari Adalats under the plan of 1772. So we have to write about the composition, functions, personal laws and limitations. Let us look at the mind map now. Before 1772, there was no uniform justice. There was the decline. Mughals lost in the Battle of Buxar. We saw the decline of Mughals. There was also a lot of corruption, and there was no proper appellate courts. Although appellate courts were designed, but they were not in full implementation. Now, how was the structure of the courts under the plan of 1772? There was Diwani Adalats, also known as civil courts. Then we had Faujdari Adalats, known as criminal courts. The appeals from the Diwani Adalat would go to Sadar Diwani Adalat, and the appeals from the Faujdari Adalats would go to Sadar Nizamat Adalats. What was the significance of the plan? This was the modern legal system. It brought in separation of powers, personal laws were recognized, and appellate structure was developed. The key features of these codes was that personal laws were applied or were applicable for Hindus and Muslims. Court fees was introduced. The court became a court of records, that is, record keeping was done, maintained, and also the lower courts were under direct supervision of the higher courts. So Warren Hastings introduced the first modern judicial plan in 1772. This plan created Diwani Adalats, also known as civil courts, and Faujdari Adalats, known as criminal courts. Applied personal laws, Hindu law for Hindus and Muslim laws for Muslims. Civil court appeals would go to Sadar Diwani and criminal appeals would go to Sadar Nizamat Adalat. There was separation of revenue and judicial functions. Court fees was introduced to reduce frivolous litigations. Record keeping was introduced. It became a court of records, and direct supervision of the higher courts. It formed the basis for the later reforms from 1774 to 1781 and the modern Indian judiciary. 1774 is when the Supreme Court was established. That's it. Thank you very much for staying around and listening. Consider sharing and subscribing if you got some value from this video. Take care. Bye-bye.